right, looking at type 1 errors and type 2 errors. A type 1 error is rejecting the null when it is true. The null is always the one that it says it is equal. So you reject that it is equal when it is actually equal. A type 2 error is not rejecting the null when it is false. So a type 2 error, you would not reject the one that is equal when it is actually not equal. So if we go ahead and look at a few of these that you missed and just explain the reasoning behind them. It says, what are the null hypotheses and the alternative hypotheses that should be used for this test? In this case, the null is that the mean is equal to 40 in this case. So that means alternative hypothesis is that it's not equal to 40. So if we're doing a type 1 error, a type 1 error is rejecting the null when it is actually true. So a type 1 error is rejecting the hypothesis that is the null. The null is the equal to 40 when it is actually true, which means when it is actually equal to 40. So type 1 error, you reject the equal to when in fact it really is equal to. Suppose the consultant decides not to reject the null. If you are not rejecting the null, what type of error might that be? That's the type 2 error when you do not reject the null, when it is actually false. So if I look at the next one here, and slide down to the correct answer. So here, my null hypothesis is that it's equal to 7.5. My alternative hypothesis is not equal to 7.5. So my type 1 error, again, type 1 error, you reject the null. The null is that it's equal to 7.5. When the null is true, the null is equal to 7.5. So you reject it when it's equal to, when in fact it really is equal to. Suppose the scientist decides not to reject the null. Again, if you do not reject the null, that is making a type 2 error. So that's pretty similar to the one we just looked at. Let's see what the next one said. Okay. So again, this is very similar to the previous ones. My null, oh, that is the same one. Okay, let me go to a different one here. Pop over to that one. Okay. So in this case, my null hypothesis is that it's equal to 7. My alternative hypothesis is that it's not equal to 7. So this one they switched around. It's a type 2 error. A type 2 error is not rejecting the null. So my type 2 error is failing to reject the null hypothesis that it's equal to when in fact it is false, so it's not equal to. So when you have a type 2 error, you're going to fail to reject that it is equal to when it really is not equal to, as opposed to the type 1 error when it was equal and equal. Suppose that Big decides, again, not to reject the null. If we do not reject the null, that's always a type 2 error when we fail to reject the null. So this one was a little bit different. It was a type 2 error. The type 2 error, you fail to reject the null hypothesis that is equal to when in fact it's false, which means it's not equal to. And one more there you have. If I slide down to the correct answer. This one was a little bit different. This one, the mean is less than or equal to. Instead of just the plain equal to, I was trying to find where the question was. It says in this case that a union of restaurant and food service workers would like to estimate this year's mean hourly wage of food service workers in the U.S. Last year's mean hourly wage was $8.16. And there is reason to believe that this year's value is greater than. So The greater than is going to be your alternative hypothesis, so the less than or equal to would be your null hypothesis, because the equal to always has to be the null. So in my correct answer here, you can see my alternative hypothesis was the greater than, my null was the less than or equal to. So I'm going to make a type 1 error. The type 1 error is rejecting the null hypothesis, which was the less than or equal to, when in fact the null is true, which means I still have the less than or equal to. So rejecting the null when the null is true. So for both of those two things, I'm going to have whatever the null hypothesis is. And then it says, suppose they decide not to reject the null. If I do not reject the null, again, I'm committing a type 2 error. So hopefully that helps you out. When you do the type 1 error, you're going to be rejecting, and both of these are going to be whatever the null hypotheses are. When you are doing the type 2 error, you're not rejecting the null, so this will be the null when the alternative is true, so this will be the alternative hypothesis if it's a type 2 error. So type 1, these should both be the same. Type 2, this should be the null, and this should be the alternative hypothesis. Hopefully that helps you out on these.